Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second Resilience 360 event. My name is Jacob Vandersteen, the founder and CEO of Wealthier. Wealthier has one specific purpose, and that is to protect enterprises from risk. So today you're going to hear from Richard Davis, our enterprise resilience practice leader on Resilience 360. And through the lens of a real-world story, actually a set of them, leveraging his over 30 years in cybersecurity and the legal field, as well as as a technologist, you'll be able to gain an insight to how enterprises can be safe from the risks that are emerging from emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, as well as quantum computers, among many others. A philosophy that has always served me well in life is if you learn something, take action with it. So we're going to give everybody the opportunity to take action. And specifically what we mean is to receive a business intel report. So that's about a 10-page research report specific to your enterprise, your organization. You can just drop at any point during this webinar. You can go to our website, wealthier.com. That's wealthier with a Y. And you'll be able to just enter that form and we'll put you in. We can only select 5 or so that will be able to get the business intel report because it is an upfront lift, but we absolutely will get to everybody at some point with the business intel report, given you are an enterprise leader. The outcome of today is that, as I mentioned, you'll be able to have a greater understanding of cybersecurity risk. And again, more presently, what is going on today, the new attack vectors and the new ways that cyber criminals are attempting to inflict losses upon organizations and to have their ill-gotten gains, but not under Rich's watch. Rich, I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction there, Jacob. I really appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm going to give a review of an incident that involved a company in New York City. That company, unfortunately, was struck by a ransomware incident. And I'm going to walk you through just a couple of key things that were related to that incident, focusing a bit on the supply chain aspect of it and the impact and implications. So can you see my agenda?
Very clear.
All right. So we're gonna get right into it, folks. So let me move to the next slide. All right. I think Jacob did some justice for me there by indicating what my background was, and really appreciate that. I'm not going to belabor that any further. I'm just going to dive right into what the incident related to. In August of this year, Genesis, which is a well-established company in New York City, they were struck by ransomware. The company has several locations, and unfortunately, all of those locations were out of business by virtue of the fact that there was a full encryption of all of the critical systems that allowed the company to serve its customers. Over the years, there are over 100,000 regular repeat customers that are served. And it was pretty significant in terms of not just crippling the operations, but you also have to be concerned about financial losses, reputational harm, and any potential fallout as a result of regulatory reporting requirements. So at the end of the day, we're seeing a lot more sophisticated ransomware attacks. We've got threat actors popping up, rebranding themselves, et cetera. And it's only exacerbated by the fact that as companies are increasingly dependent on bespoke services that come from their supply chain, that supply chain itself is often targeted in ways that result in significant ripple effects throughout the supply chain ecosystem. And so it's really important to have a holistic, comprehensive view, not just of your enterprise, but also of your supply chain, the dependencies within that supply chain, and full line of sight to the extent possible into the practices of the various supply chain members. Okay. So what I'm sharing at this point in time is an actual message that was sent to me. And at the end of the day, an affiliate of the organization of Genesis reached out and basically said to me via text that there was a significant attack And I'm showing just a little screenshot of the communication. And I'm actually sharing the message. And the message was related to the fact that the systems of the organization were encrypted. And you can see that the threat actor basically says your data has been stolen and encrypted. And if you don't pay the ransom, it's going to be published. This is very typical of what one would expect to see. The other key thing is that they were very polite in terms of providing a basis for the organization to communicate. As you can see from the second bolded piece of the message, there was a guarantee from the threat actor that they were going to fulfill on their promise to provide decryption once the ransom was paid. They provide some significant or relevant details about what the organization needs to do and how they can be contacted. And so I've gotten rid of some information here as it relates to the specifics around the personal ID, things of that nature. But as you can see, they're very deliberate in terms of their communication. And it's not uncommon for them to set up a communication site where you can communicate with them, figure out what the protocol needs to be as it relates to resolving the issue. Okay. So this next slide is a continuation of the message. The message basically says that tells the customer, or I shouldn't even say customer, tells the victim that they shouldn't do anything with the impacted systems. Do not reach out to the authorities. They won't help. In fact, our government agencies are inundated with scenarios whereby they get phone calls, they get messages. There's actually a site that you can report the fact that you've been impacted. But what these threat actors do is they essentially operate on a model, and that model is predicated on the fact that if you do every single thing they say, they will do everything that they commit to doing, right? So you don't really have to worry about, in most instances, you don't have to worry about not getting your decryption keys because it's a business model. So folks, ransomware in today's world is a syndicated business model where the threat actors all have different roles and the different specialties. So you will have a threat actor that specializes in initial access. And so there's no question in the scenario that I've been involved in, that particular threat actor obtained credentials through the dark web through what's called an initial access broker, right? They go out and they harvest millions of credentials. And what they'll do is they will post these credentials on a site, and somebody else, another threat actor, basically it's a threat actor marketplace, another threat actor that has certain capabilities once they get the initial access to actually begin to deploy the ransomware will come into the picture. And what's happened lately is that the threat actors now will rent the ransomware from other providers and developers. And the threat actors that actually do the deployment of the ransomware will likely have to take a test before they are approved to use the ransomware against victims. It's properly insane what's happening right now. So ransomware as a service has really taken off, but as you can see here from this message, it goes on to delineate what the customer, again, I said customer, what the victim should or shouldn't do. Okay. Don't go to recovery companies. That's what they're saying. For those who have cyber insurance, they'll basically say, hey, listen, your insurance is going to cover this. Don't worry about it. Just pay us and we'll be good. So in this particular instance, the way that we approached it is we leveraged a company that specializes in setting up wallets for Bitcoin wallets for scenarios where the Bitcoin wallet needs to be funded. They will actually act as an intermediary, make sure that wallet gets funded, and they will function as a decryption key broker once the ransom has been paid. The threat actor will also provide help to the victim in recovery in many instances, because again, it's a business model. And what these threat actors will do is if you have any problems using their decryptor, they'll actually act like a help desk and help you with respect to how the decryptor needs to be used in your specific environment to recover your files. So this threat actor is formerly known as Inc. Ransomware, right? They showed up on the scene back in July of 2023. And they essentially use the ransomware to do precisely what occurred to the Genesis company. And even though the company was adversely affected, the threat actors might come out and say, you failed our penetration test. And in fact, that was one of the messages that was on the screen. They actually see themselves in some instances as folks who will come in and test your defenses. And to the extent you fail, you're now the victim of ransomware. They've taken on this persona of a benign red team, but they're anything but benign, as they will, once they get past your defenses, whether it's through a publicly facing weak web-based asset, they will essentially give you a report on how they got in. And using that information, you can remediate certain conditions. At least that's not always the case, but in this particular case, that was how it went down. And the techniques that are often used by folks, but this particular threat actor, they do a lot of spear phishing. They do a lot of, so phishing is one of the ways that they will actually get the information if they're not going to an initial access broker to get the credentials into your system. So it's really important to make sure that any externally facing assets that you have that have administrative credentials, because once administrative credentials to firewalls or any externally facing asset or web facing asset is out there, it just makes it that much easier for the threat actor, once they've gotten past or gotten in, to begin to move laterally. Making sure that default passwords are not left, default credentials are not left in place, because that's a part of what's sold on the dark web. They have entire repositories and libraries of admin credentials for different firewall manufacturing devices, et cetera. So it's really important to make sure that your multi-factor authentication is in place. Really important to make sure that password rotation for administrative credentials takes place. It's really important to make sure that the complexity of your passwords is such that it makes it extremely difficult. NIST recommends that passwords be between 8 to 12 characters. On some of the cyber liability insurance policies that I've reviewed of late, the questions relate to having 15 character passwords. So my recommendation for any organization would be to maximize the number of characters that you use in your passwords, make complex passphrases, complex passwords, but increase the number of characters that need to be included. As it relates to privileged accounts, make sure that you have a privileged access management tool to manage those accounts. It's never been more precarious than it's been today. Again, super, super important to ensure that your credential management process is in place. Super important to make sure that you have the proper incident response protocols, such that if your entire organization is impacted, particularly your communication and collaboration capabilities that would allow you to respond to such a scenario, it's critically important that you have an out-of-band communication and collaboration solution that provides you with the ability to mount an appropriate response and recovery. And that's one of the things that we do here at Wealthier. We do provide organizations with line of sight to various things that they can do to improve their resilience, and in the event of such an incident, respond appropriately. Okay. So this slide really speaks to the ongoing threat landscape. We're continuing to see very sophisticated attacks, and what's starting to happen is the use of AI, threat actor use of AI. The first bullet here talks about threat actor specialization and syndication. I did mention the fact that threat actors are increasingly highly specialized. Some are initial access brokers, other folks are specialists in developing the actual ransomware kits. And then you have other threat actors that will then rent out those kits, provided they meet the developer, the malicious code and ransomware development qualification criteria. They will then be allowed to use those kits to implement the ransomware. And so what's really happening, and that we're very concerned about in the security space, is the use of AI to make some of these techniques and tactics and procedures much more effective, and allows threat actors to scale their attacks. And not only is it a function of the sophistication of the threat actor, it's also a function of the supply chain's resilience. Many of the ransomware incidents that I've been involved in the past have involved supply chain members that just don't have the requisite controls, whether they be administrative controls that are primarily policy-based, or technical controls, which basically focus on the endpoint, the network, and the perimeter. They don't have the controls in place that one would expect them to be able to ward off attacks. One of the other areas that's really, excuse me, important is vulnerability management. If one does not have the appropriate line of sight to the components in your supply chain's environment, what can happen is a vulnerability can result in an access point for that threat actor. And what oftentimes happens is vulnerabilities are classified as low, but if you daisy chain multiple low vulnerabilities, you might end up with a 0-day. And a 0-day is something that doesn't really, it's never been exploited or reported or known, but given the interdependency of various systems, software libraries, and supply chain participants, daisy chaining vulnerabilities is something that needs to be seriously looked at. And in 2021, the Biden administration issued executive order to shore up American national security. And a part of that was the concept of software bill of materials, SBOMs. And SBOMs help organizations do a better job of managing not just the vulnerabilities in their enterprise, but also in their supply chain. Now, you combine all of that with the regulatory pressures that are coming down on a lot of different organizations. You now have the perfect storm, right? You have the pressure to comply from a regulatory perspective, and then you have the pressure from just a evolving threat landscape perspective. And I've highlighted a couple of regs here. Most people are very familiar with GDPR, very familiar with CPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. New York Department of Financial Services Reg 500 has 19 sections that apply to companies depending on the size of the company, but they're very specific about some of the things that you need to have in place, whether it's a C, you need to do testing on a regular basis. You need to make sure that your supply chain, that you have line of sight as to what's going on there. We have a high degree of expertise in those areas. And then you have the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is an EU-based piece of legislation, which is highly prescriptive. One of the most significant things about DORA is that it is prescriptive as it relates to how penetration tests should be run. And there's a concept that they have been very adamant that organizations need to adhere to, and that's threat-led penetration testing. In other words, you need to make sure that the testing you do aligns with the threats that your organization is likely to face, right? So it's very prescriptive in that regard. I did mention about AI and automation, and I did touch on the fact that AI facilitates automated attacks. It facilitates the ability to scale an attack. It facilitates the ability of threat actors to dynamically evolve the nature of their attack, even modify code in such a way that, based on reconnaissance, they can determine would be successful if deployed in your environment. They'll look at your security controls and they'll say, okay, let's tweak the code a little bit. If this, then change certain codes to evade certain security controls. And then incident response, critically important, as I mentioned previously, to make sure that You have an out-of-band communication and collaboration capability. And that out-of-band capability should include all of the key participants in the support of the critical systems that the organization has. It should include all of your critical vendors. It might include your crisis communications and PR folks. It might also include your legal counsel, your outside legal counsel. It should include all of the parties that you would think would be necessary. And it should also include regular tabletop testing, where you go through exercises to assess the efficacy of what you've put in place. Resilience 360. So this framework was developed because of what I saw as very silo needs, capabilities. The thought process here was to provide a more holistic approach to the various domains that are involved in enterprise resilience. The thought process was really centered around making sure that there's a more cohesive approach to security in the enterprise and throughout the supply chain. So here at Wealthier, what we've done is we have a portfolio of solutions that lend themselves to addressing resilience from a data security perspective. Knowing your data is critically important, knowing where it is, knowing how it's used, knowing the criticality of that data to your business processes, very important. And from that perspective, and forgive me there's my phone that I thought I put on mute, and I did not. And so I'll do that. Getting back to, so we have a series of solutions that help organizations address the business challenges, irrespective of what your remit is as a stakeholder. If you're a general counsel, there are certain e-discovery capabilities that, sorry, there it goes again. Certain e-discovery capabilities that lend themselves to identifying data in the enterprise to be able to know where the data exists, know where your critical PCI, PII, your healthcare information, all of the relevant business process information that's important. And so the Resilience 360 approach creates greater cohesion within the enterprise and the supply chain. So we're continuously looking at the marketplace to see what's out there, continuously looking to see what technologies can be brought to bear in a bespoke way. We're looking at innovators that have innovative technologies that can help with things like AI bills of material, which are increasingly important. 488 pieces of legislation have been submitted on a national basis with regard to AI assurance. Lots of different implications for lots of different companies who are monitoring all of the AI legislation. And we understand what the implications are, and we can certainly help organizations manage the AI, we can help organizations manage AI from the CI/CD pipeline through deployment. It's critically important that you have provenance and lineage of all of the components of AI, and that will help organizations mitigate certain AI-specific threats, such as AI poisoning or exfiltration of certain models. AI poisoning is critically important for the financial sector to look at and to mitigate, because of the increasing use of AI in transactions, clearing and settlement, et cetera. If your models are messed up because you have an insider or because a threat actor has poisoned your AI, skewed your models, you can lose billions of dollars and be subject to all kinds of class action scenarios. So who are the beneficiaries of Resilience 360 with regard to board of directors? If you're a board of director member, you have to have line of sight into organizational risk. And if you don't, what essentially you're doing is you might breach your fiduciary duty if you're not if you don't have the line of sight, if you're aware of a particular condition, that awareness creates a duty to act. Board members are beneficiaries of the approach that we take. We do a lot of consulting with senior folks who may not have the technical understanding of some of the things that are out there that can impact their role. Certainly, if you're a CISOs are largely focused on a lot of ongoing operational, keep the business running type activities. And what we do is we help advise CISOs by providing them with some of the solutions that are out there that can help them do things like address the NIST ask that they look at the encryption schemes that are used in their environment. And the reason why I mention this is because post-quantum cryptography is one of those big issues that are out there. I've done a lot of research in this area, and there's a lot of good information that I have on cryptographic schemes, cryptographic methodologies, key encapsulation methodologies, how you can use quantum random number generation to better manage those keys. There's a ton of research that we've done in that area. Chief legal officers, you can rest assured that when it comes to complying with regulations that are sometimes opaque, we can help with regard to some of those things. When it comes to e-discovery, we have lots and lots of experience in that area, data management, data protection. A lot of the tools that we use come out of the e-discovery and the litigation world. They have now been adapted to satisfy some other requirements, such as those of the chief privacy officer, being able to identify data so that they can be more effective in responding to data subject access requests and things of that nature. At the end of the day, regardless of what your role is, it's you in the enterprise. You have to be aware of what's out there in order to make sure that the organization has resilience from a regulatory perspective, from a cyber threat perspective, incredibly important. Managing that third-party relationship chain is extremely important. Being able to, excuse me, get to all of your master services agreements and make sure that your obligations are propagated throughout your supply chain is really super important, and we can help you do that. We can help automate the contracts, your MSAs. Those are the things that essentially are the administrative controls around the things that your supply chain needs to engage in. And we also engage in a lot of training, because it's not just about the security controls. It's not just about the technical or administrative controls. It's about changing the mindset of the organization. You have to understand human behavior. You have to understand organizational culture. You have to understand the baseline maturity of the organization, such that you're not trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. And so we have a really good holistic approach with respect to addressing challenges, many of those faced by the Genesis organization that experienced that supply chain issue that they had with regard to ransomware. At this juncture, there is a belief that, as it relates to Genesis, that the supply chain is incredibly crucial to the incident, in the sense that there may have been various things that occurred that did not lend itself to providing the level of security that would have been expected. At this point, I'd like to pause for any questions.
Outstanding, Rich. And I got to say, it is even better than the first time. The clarity, the conciseness, and of course, having the story behind it of a real world example is very hard hitting. So we're now going to open up to Q&A. So I'll let the questions roll in. And it is a great time to mention as well that you can stop on our website right on the front page, wealthier.com, wealthier with a Y. You can submit a form and we will put you in a batch to receive a business intel report. So that's a custom 10-page report specific to your threat landscape, to your industry, to your strategic goals that we will put together. So go ahead and do that now while you can. Like I said earlier, it's one thing to learn, but every time you learn something, you should be looking to put it into action. So we're giving you that opportunity. In terms of Q&A, I will go ahead and open it up. Feel free, for anyone who is new to Zoom webinars, it's quite similar to how you would engage in the chat on Zoom. Just open up your settings and there's a spot that'll say chat, and I will be able to see that, and we'll take that as Q&A. But to get started with the first question, let me hand select. The question here is, what role does leadership play in building a resilient organization, and how can executives foster a risk-aware culture within their teams?
That's a great question. Executives play a pivotal role in an organization's risk posture, and it's really a function of culture. And the messaging has to come from the top. And the messaging comes from the top. The training needs to be across the board. The training needs to be at the board level. There needs to be awareness at the board level. There needs to be an understanding of the threat landscape. There needs to be an understanding of the vectors, the attack vectors. So Training is critically important. Having regular training, regular attestations of understanding the various computer use policies, the anti-phishing activities. The role that those executives can play is to incentivize those folks within their organization to have an interest in security. It's incentivizing, you have to incentivize them to do that. You need to make sure that what you represent in your policies are things that you actually do not have a policy that says that you do something and you don't enforce it. So it's critically important to have those education and awareness programs on an ongoing basis, and then propagate those programs from the enterprise to your supply chain and get the buy-in, whichever way possible, from your supply chain, whether contractually or otherwise.
So this next question goes right along with it, and that is around the rise of BYOD, bring your own device.
Right.
So it's very common in today's cybersecurity landscape where organizations have a non-bring your own device policy. So you do not bring your own device. You have to have company registered devices and everything like that. How would Resilience 360 approach those situations from both, let's say, the legal scope, but also the technological scope of managing the risk with those kind of
Sure. BYOD devices have traditionally presented a quandary because of the potential of A, data exfiltration, and B, commingling of information that either is proprietary and personal. I've seen scenarios, the technology has gotten a lot better. So using things like Intune, using things where you can actually, segregate communications and have corporate communications occur through a separate channel, corporate data stored in a separate vault, as it were, on those devices. So it's really important, A, to ensure that you have the technical controls to facilitate the ability to protect corporate data. And there are lots of tools out there, but you got to have a solid written policy. The biggest incident that I've been involved in that involved a personal device was years ago when I was working on the BP Deepwater Horizon matter, where one of the only people to ever be charged was guilty of deleting emails, corporate emails from their device. Okay, so that to me is a glaring example of a BYOD failure, in part because of the lack of availability or poor implementation of some of those controls around the device.
Great. And then we have a question about AI bills of materials and really just what that is all about and how people should be aware of that and what they should be aware of, to be specific.
So the concept of bills of material for software have been around for quite some time. There has been a push by CISA to socialize different types of bills of material. And the goal of a BOM, SBOM, software bill of material, or AI BOM, AI bill of material, is to provide line of sight to the components in the software applications and ultimately the business process that is reliant on those software libraries, on those tools. To the extent that you have line of sight to those tools, the underlying data, and I'm going to answer the AI bill of material piece specifically. If you have line of sight to the models, the algorithms, and all of the components that go into the AI that's leveraged in the organization, you can more effectively demonstrate that you have done everything possible to eliminate bias in your AI models. You can more effectively control the development of AI and the deployment of AI, ensuring that you have provenance and lineage of all of the components, such that if something was adulterated along the way, you can more readily identify that. You can also more effectively respond to regulatory inquiries as it relates to the protocols that you've used to mitigate bias. So the bill of material concept is pretty much an extension, at least the AI bill of material concept is an extension of the SBOM, of the software bill of material, but it takes into account the components of AI over which there should be some provenance and lineage documentation around that AI. And there are also other bombs as well, such as a cryptographic bomb that helps organizations with preparing for to become post-quantum cryptography ready. Happy to have some off the out of band communications with folks on any one of those topics.
Excellent. Now, this one is probably on a lot of people's minds. It's about how to prevent and to be more proactive when it comes to cyber risks. How can a company become more proactive instead of just passive or reactive with their posture?
It really is a function of the enterprise, of your profile. And one of the things about the intelligence reports that we developed, the bespoke intelligence reports that you offered, Jacob, is that we help organizations determine where they can focus. If you're a smaller regional entity, you're not going to have the same challenges as a larger multinational. With a larger multinational, it could be a focus more on the supply chain. It could be a focus on vulnerabilities that attack OT SCADA systems, depending on what industry you happen to be in. But it's really about profiling your organization, right? So if you're a manufacturer, you should know that there are certain things that you need to do to ensure that your manufacturing supply chain and critical path manufacturing processes are sound. If you are an energy company, it's critically important that you understand the componentry that exists in whatever plant you may be operating. If you're in exploration and production, that's different than if you're in the pipeline side of things like Kinder Morgan, or Exxon is concerned about drilling operations. And then Kinder Morgan handles the pipeline piece. So it really is understand the profile of your organization, understand your critical business processes, understand and harmonize the severity levels that are used across the enterprise. If you're a compendium of companies that basically you've grown by acquisition, make sure that you are harmonized across the board. I've seen way too many scenarios where companies will acquire another company, acquired company doesn't want to change this or doesn't want to change that. It only adds to the complexity, and complexity of that nature lends itself to potential gaps. So understand your business profile.
Another question is around deepfakes and how Resilience 360 could address the emergence of deepfakes in phishing or other types of generative AI.
So deepfakes are really interesting. So I've had a number of conversations with companies that are developing ways of tagging certain types of information. Part of the legislation, the research that we've done about the 488 pieces of legislation, we're happy to share some of that detail with anybody who's interested. Part of that is to address the rise of deepfakes. Deepfakes have a significant potential to impact elections. The things that organizations can do to prevent deepfakes is, I shouldn't say prevent, there's not a ton that you can do, but you can begin to create awareness, number one. Number two, make sure that voice recordings, to the extent that you do have voice recordings of senior executives, of folks that are involved in key decision making, and you have an obligation, let's say, to maintain and manage voice recordings, meetings, and things of that nature, protect that information, protect it. A classic example is what happened probably about 8 or 9 months ago, where an individual in the finance department thought that the CFO had instructed him to wire $25 million. And he wired $25 million, only come to find out that he was the victim of deep fakery. Always validate things. Always, if you receive a phone call, if you see something that's a video, valid and the implications are that there's an ask of you to do something, validate it. My voice on this call can easily be captured, right? And easily be used to convince someone that I said something, right? Or that I instructed somebody to do something. So organizations just need to be a lot more vigilant. This is an emerging area. Just make sure you keep your eye on legislation and the requirements around the legislation, particularly if you are in the business in the media business.
So this question is more around the human side of things, and it's around the executive dynamics. What have you seen most successful between the way that CISOs and CIOs and other executives are communicating and approaching cybersecurity, from the most successful organizations to those that struggle and are at risk?
That's a really great question. The CISO CIO interaction is changing. What I'm seeing is that increasingly CISOs are more straight line to the CEO and more dotted line to the CIO. The justification, and I just had a conversation with an executive about that earlier today. The justification being is there's often battles for budget, right? And that's at least a piece of it. And it's really important to have that segregation of duties. And if a CISO reports into a CIO and there are potential conflicts as it relates to risk awareness and then the activity that's needed to remediate or mitigate and the budgets that's associated with that, there can oftentimes be some sacrifice resulting in an acceptance of a higher level of exposure or risk. So I'm seeing that there's some changes there. It's really important to reframe that dynamic. And it's extremely important to have a more holistic approach where it's not just technical controls, but it's really about understanding the business, aligning with business leaders. And so that's primarily where I'm seeing a lot of that change from a culture perspective is more so having more independence from the CIO's direct line.
Excellent. And this one is more a question around smaller organizations. Let's say sub 10 million revenue, those 10 million and over, under 100 million. What can organizations like that do to be safe? And obviously, it's a different scale than enterprise, but what, in your experience, can organizations like that do to be protected?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And my recommendation is to have a qualified virtual CISO if your organization isn't large enough to have a dedicated CISO. And so if you have the someone with the requisite competencies in the sub $10 million organization range, then that affords the organization, I think, more opportunities to implement rigor and mature their posture. You don't have to have a full-time person, but here at Wealthier, we do have virtual CISOs that can allocate a certain block of time to ensure that the organization's posture is state of the art. Just because you're a $5 million company does not mean that you can't have state of the art technology that protects you and have the requisite CISO mindset to ensure that the threat landscape is something that's covered, that you're somewhat future proofed, that from a regulatory, from a security controls perspective, you have the right things in place. That would be my recommendation. A lot of regs, for example, DFS 500, you don't have to have a CISO. If you are below, I think it's 10 million, I think it was revised to 15 million recently, but you don't have to have a CISO. But why should you have a CISO? Because that person's role isn't IT, right? It's security, but it involves IT. So there's a lot of good opportunity to harmonize security and operational infrastructure. So I would suggest looking at having a virtual CISO, somebody with the requisite competencies to support you.
Excellent. And this one is a bit on the opposite scale. So what is the ideal case for a larger enterprise that may have significant cybersecurity controls and protections, but that is looking to lead and be state of the art in their systems? What's the ideal state that an organization like that can reach?
Yeah, when I think the first question that I asked when I was in the pharmaceutical industry, the first question I asked on day one was, what is the state of your CMDB, Configuration Management Database? That's the system of record for the enterprise, right? And not only is it the system of record for all of your assets, but it should also be the system of record for all of your software applications, and you should be able to tie in all of the relevant information about vulnerabilities that are specific to you. I've spent a lot of time working with organizations that are mired in dealing with vulnerabilities that have nothing to do with them. That's A. Or B, dealing with vulnerabilities that they have no idea where those vulnerabilities exist in the enterprise. So for a large enterprise, it's really important, I think, to ensure that you have a good data quality in your CMDB. And that information should lead to better actionability around vulnerabilities that are in the enterprise. Obviously, you're going to have your training, you're going to have your vulnerability management, attack surface reduction, all these other functions and things of that nature. But making sure that you have a really good line of sight to all of the components that are in your critical business processes from a software as well as infrastructure perspective.
Awesome. Another one here is about quantifying supply chain risk.
Mm-hmm.
And a company that's in the early stages of that is seeking to make sure they do it in the appropriate and most effective way.
Yes, quantifying risk has always been a very significant challenge because you have quantitative metrics and qualitative metrics. One of the approaches that I think will begin to take shape is having the ability to collaborate with your supply chain around their posture and software bill of materials. And I go back to this, I've been harping on this for some time, to the extent that supply chain members provide line of sight to the enterprise as it relates to their infrastructure, as it relates to their software composition, I think that is going to significantly help reduce risk. So that's one facet of it, having that line of sight to the components in your supply chain supporting critical business processes. The other piece to it is propagating the obligations you have and propagating the standards that you have via policy to your supply chain contractually, right? Getting your suppliers to sign on by some means, whether it's incentivization or penalization, whatever it happens to be, you got to attack it from two ways, right? Line of sight to the infrastructure, the practices, et cetera, and then you have to look at it from a contractual perspective as well. So those are the two things that I would focus on, and obviously CMDB, data
Great.
quality. Yeah.
Just a few more minutes, so everybody make sure if you have a pressing question to get it into the Q&A. Otherwise, this one is perhaps staying on that state-of-the-art subject. It's about polymorphic and metamorphic malware and what sort of preparations and protections you've seen against those sort of attacks.
Those are AI candidates for AI XDR capabilities, right? And so when you have static malicious code, it's really easy to develop signatures and to know what to look for and what to block. When you have polymorphic code, malicious code, that is designed to evade your detection and response capabilities. Fight AI with AI, right? The polymorphic malicious code should be met with AI-based behavioral analytics, where you can more effectively identify anomalous behavior. And that anomalous behavior it could be a persona or it could be code, right? Being able to detect that anomalous behavior is something that a lot of tools that are leveraging AI can do today very effectively. I would keep my eye out on technologies that are using heuristics, behavioral heuristics, whether it be at an application level, a business process level, a persona level, a credential level. These are all things, variables that can help address some of the challenges around polymorphic malicious code.
Great. So we have two more questions here. One is around zero trust architecture. It's an organization that has not fully adopted this yet, but is seeking to bring that into their approach.
I've done work in the past with some zero trust capabilities, and I think it's really important to the extent you don't already have line of sight or a project where that type of architecture is being implemented, that it be looked at. If you look at the threat landscape, you can no longer rely on traditional technologies and traditional capabilities. You must begin to implement ways of ensuring that every persona, every object that enters into the enterprise is vetted and validated, authenticated without and access to resources, services, and data within the enterprise. You cannot rely on traditional means, trusted means of granting access to objects within the enterprise. I think it's important to look at things like Zscaler and various other tools out there that provide some of the support for zero trust.
Excellent. Last question here is, we recently just saw the China quantum computer advancement where they were able to, can't recollect exactly, but they were able to crack an encryption that was not able to be cracked before using a quantum computer. How soon should enterprises be preparing for such threats?
I would say CISA has been trying to, and NIST have been ringing the alarm bell since probably 2017. Nobody's really paid that much attention, but the threat of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, and again, that's a type of quantum computer that is specifically designed to address the factoring problems that encryption by its very nature creates to protect data. The availability of a viable cryptographically relevant computer is something that was predicted to arise many years ago. I think Professor Peter Shor, he predicted that in 94, he predicted that by 2025, we would have a viable cryptographically relevant machine. There have been lots and lots of challenges with that because to maintain a quantum state, you have to have a lot of power and you have to have significant temperature controls to maintain a state that lends itself to proper quantum computing. Recent innovations in materials that can operate at higher temperatures are likely to accelerate the quantum machine. We're going to see nation states be the first to have the capability: China, North Korea, Iran. We're going to see those nation state, Russia. We'll see them probably have the capability, but then after that, then you'll see proxies begin to leverage those capabilities. I would take inventory now. And so post-quantum cryptography readiness is something that needs to be done by large organizations to make sure that they can make the switch when needed. Happy to have an offline discussion with anybody who's interested in those discussions.
Outstanding. Well, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, that's the top of the hour. We hope you enjoyed our Resilience 360 event today and we're able to answer many of your questions. So the final step here, as I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and drop our website link. You can go ahead and fill the form out on the front page of the website, and we will put you in the mix to get a custom business intel report, which is a deep dive from your strategic goals, but also your threat landscape and the opportunities that your organization has to protect yourself from cyber threats and also be more resilient as you continue to grow. So thank you all for attending. One last thing is that if you did sign up for this event, as if you're here, you did, you will be notified of all of our upcoming events as well. So we hope to see you in one of those and have a phenomenal rest of your day.
Stay tuned. Thanks, everybody.